Welcome to Warrior Money, the show devoted to supporting our brother and sister veterans in business. I'm Patrick Murphy.
And I'm Dan Kunze.
Today's guest is a decorated Navy SEAL turned journalist and entrepreneur, and a founder of Siebert Valor, a fintech company built for the military community and first responders. Siebert Valor empowers veterans and active members of first responders to secure their financial future through smart investing and tailored financial education. Please welcome Kaj Larsen. Kaj, welcome to Warrior Money.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. It's amazing that there is a podcast dedicated to what I've devoted the last couple of years of my life to.
I know.
I'm so happy.
I know.
Yeah.
We're so glad to have you. Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, it's amazing. And listen, we all get along because you're Navy and we're Army. So
we totally don't get along at all now. One team, one fight. You know?
That's right. That's right. Hey, Kaj, you and I have been friends for years. Your role as a journalist, right? And when you look at journalism and, freedom of the press and speech, when you look at it's more dangerous than ever in foreign lands, but also at home when you throw out misinformation. How do you pick what stories you're going to cover and what things you're trying to bring out into the light?
Yeah, well, just to be clear, I describe myself as a reformed journalist these days, So in the past, I'm actually really proud of my journalism career and the things that I was able to do and the stories I was able to cover, especially in the military vertical, like a domain that the three of us care so much about. And I think in the past, what I was really focused on was the stories that emanated and emerged out of our community and our experience that were relevant to the American public. So I was the first person to be waterboarded on national TV, when the American public didn't really understand this debate that we were having. So those stories have always remained really important to me. I will say that I think this is one of the most challenging things for our country and our community right now. There is no sort of moratorium on truth. There's no generally accepted truth. And I think the information battle space is 100% up for grabs. You see that both from the front lines in a place like Israel and Gaza to the headlines of Der Spiegel or Yahoo News. This information battle space, this is the contested domain, very different than the kinetic wars that we all fought.
Right. And you got to be after it. And you got to get after it. And you can't just assume that's going to happen, right? You got to be a participant. We're going to go into the fintech company in just a second. But, as someone who lectures at Wharton Business School, right? I'm very passionate that half the veterans of World War II start their own small business, creating Comcast and Nike and Walmart. But our generation of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, the post-9/11 generation, it's less than 5%. Why do you think that's the case? And how do you think you could be helpful?
Well, listen, Patrick, I know we're friends, right? But if you're going to name drop Wharton, I'm going to name drop Harvard, right? So the year, in 1942, the graduating class of Harvard, 100% of eligible males went into military service, right? There's obviously some people who weren't physically capable of serving, but 100%. The entire country mobilized for war, right? Fast forward to the year that I graduated from Harvard, 2007, the total number of assessing into military service, part of this was because of ROTC and stuff, was almost zero, right? So there was this great book about this called AWOL. You may have read it, American Elite's Unexcused Absence from the Military. Yeah. And I think you've seen a massive cultural change in warfighting from the entire country being mobilized to a small, dedicated few.
Yeah, talk to us a little bit about your transition. How did you get to military service in the first place? Like, how did that transition happen? What called you to it? And how did you find your first purpose there?
Well, I like to say that my great-grandfather actually served in the Tsar's band in the Russian army. My grandfather served in the Navy band in World War II. But I'm tone deaf and I can't play an instrument, so I had to become a commando. My only choice. Look, I think we're talking to ourselves up here, but at some point, every man has to ask themselves, how do you want to be of service? And for me, my father being Marine, both my grandfathers, my serving in the service, there was almost no question that at some point I was going to find a way to serve. I went to the Naval Academy at 17, thought I wanted to fly because, like you guys, I can recite all the lines from Top Gun.
Right.
Both of them.
And then ultimately found a community that fit my personality and skill set better.
Yeah.
That's
well,
great.
Listen, I feel the need for speed.
Yeah,
so there
baby.
you go. Listen, your name dropping Harvard. I thought you were going to say UC Santa Cruz because that's right. So, another place where you graduate from. But how about that military service? And now that as an entrepreneur in fintech, right? What are some of those traits that you saw? I mean, you talked about a purpose-driven life, and every man has to look in the mirror and ask himself, what are you doing to serve? But how's that relate to business and the folks you're trying to help?
Yeah, I mean, I do think in some ways it goes back to what you said about like all the greatest generation coming back and building the greatest economic engine the world has ever seen, and them really able to harness those skills into the private sector. In fact, at Siebert Valor, I've actually been doing this small little YouTube social media series called Vetrepreneurs, where I highlight these extraordinary entrepreneurs who have military service and people you might not think about normally, like John Paul DeJorio, right, who's one of the co-founders of Paul Mitchell.
Right.
Navy
Homeless,
veteran.
Navy veteran, and he's a billionaire. Like, amazing.
And an extraordinary person, right? And he, I'm friends with JP. I spoke to him the other day, and he was actually talking about how his military service in the Navy gave him like some of the discipline in order to succeed in life. And those stories are extraordinary to me, and I think one of our missions now on the veteran side is to help tell those stories.
When you were transitioning from service, how did you isolate on the financial problem to solve, and how did you figure that as an area? What compelled you to it?
So I think one of the first places that you and I met, Pat, was when I came out of the service and I helped start an organization called The Mission Continues, along with my buddy. We used some of our combat pay, to start this philanthropic organization. And then that went on to help incubate and seed Team Rubicon. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about veteran service and helping create the veteran service sector. And what I realized during that time is everything that we believe is still true, that veterans need a sense of purpose. But if there's a problem with the purse, all of the purpose in the world doesn't matter. So look, we can give guys new jobs and new missions in public service. We can even give them meaning and mission in their life. But if they come home to $30,000 worth of credit card debt, it probably all goes out the window. And so by, sort of haphazard and dumb luck, I met my co-founder, who was a Navy intel veteran, and we say intel and operations go hand in hand. He had a 20-year career on Wall Street, and I really started to believe that the best way that I could help veterans was to help close this wealth gap and this knowledge gap when it came to investing and building your wealth.
Yeah, I mean, as Ronald Reagan said himself, the best social program in the world is a JOB job.
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to pay you.
Exactly.
And part of that is that when you look at in the fintech world, right? How do you help our brother and sister, in the warrior class, the veterans, the first responders, and their family members navigate that you set them up for successful financial success?
Yeah, I think the very, very first gap to overcome, and the hardest gap to overcome, is this information asymmetry, this knowledge gap. When we were first in the military, probably like me, I was a lot more focused on warfighting than I was on public equities, or on investing or on trading or anything like that. It was all gunslinging at that time. And I think that's not uncharacteristic for a lot of service members who have this extraordinary passionate desire to serve. So what we did is we built a technology, a self-directed investing technology, think like a Robinhood or an E-Trade, but that was really devoted to service members and how we think. And part of that was just devoting a third of the app is dedicated to financial literacy and education, right? Mm-hmm. And there are programs within the military, but they are what economists would call necessary but not sufficient. There's a lot of room for the private sector to help jump in and close that wealth gap.
Yeah, so we talked about a lot about the wealth gap, and that, in my opinion, our opinion, wealth gap can also lead to political instability, which then leads into some of the national security controversies and things that we've been hearing now. I'm really interested. There's a lot of noise out in the news right now. How do you parse through that noise? How do you get to some of the answers? How do you do it, and how do you suggest us getting into that misinformation cloud, I would say?
Yeah, look, I wish I had a pat answer for you, but there isn't a pat answer, right? I think part of it is that comes down to trust. And I've always believed that money moves at the speed of trust. So one of the reasons I started the business in the first place is that USAA, which I would I would roll the dice and bet money that you have a USAA card in your wallet and you have a USAA card in your wallet, right? Okay, right? So it's safe money, right? We all have utilized USAA at some point, and you would think that they had the sort of market cornered on investing. Truth is, USAA sold off their investing products to Schwab years ago, right? And so there wasn't a company that was really dedicated to wealth building for the military community. And again, because money, and I'll get back to your question more directly, but ultimately what I believe is that it's about trust. Money moves at the speed of trust, and these days, information also moves at the speed of trust. So part of the premise, part of why what you guys are doing so important is I think you close that trust gap when you have walked in similar worlds. Because we've worn the cloth of the country, because we've been in uniform, I think other veterans are more predisposed to listen to us, not guaranteed, but more likely to listen to us than someone who hasn't written that blank check.
Yeah.
And so that was the idea behind it.
I wasn't trying to make that a trap to make it so it was hard, but I think we are living through a world where it's hard to trust what's happening on one side. It's hard to trust what's happening on the other side. And this whole fragmentation and this bridge essentially is shifting and changing right now. So it is hard to understand that.
I think the meta problem, I know we could talk about this all day, but the meta problem is that we used to have a world of institutional trust.
Yeah.
And institutional trust is totally, completely gone. So then the pendulum swung to this world of individual trust where everybody just made up their own truth. And we found out that doesn't work either, right? So there's got to be a new form of trust. And my suggestion, I don't know, I have some wild ideas, but my suggestion is that some of it is more approximate to a scientific method where there's peer reviewed. And we actually built our platform based on this kind of collective intelligence or this James Surowiecki wisdom of crowds. So if you go on the Siebert Valor app, which is an investing platform, you actually see this crowdsourced intelligence model, which is a really innovative product.
Yeah,
and you aggregate the top portfolios on the platform. You might have seen the Goldman VIP index or something, but the idea, the actual original inspiration came out of Navy intelligence school, where they did a crowdsourced investigation to find a lost submarine.
It's funny, the most trusted thing that I ever do is my peer reviews when I was going through my organizations. If I was in peer review and my peers said something about one person and 12 people said the same thing, we kind of coalesced around that.
Right. And look, I'll give the Army its flowers. The Army has been further ahead of at least the Naval Special Operations community in terms of using peer review, but we are quickly drafting in the Army wake and using that.
Especially it's important now because when you look at the trust, as you mentioned, institutions, whether it's the church, our government, banks, corporate America, luckily for the three of us here and for our brothers and sisters out there, the trust level is still high for military veterans. So we're gonna dive into that when we get back. We're gonna take a quick break and we'll be right back. More with Kaj Larsen in just a second. Welcome back to Word Money. We're joined by Kaj Larsen. Kaj, Navy SEAL, entrepreneur. A lot of folks out there, when you look at consumer confidence, down about a little over 22%, and 70% of our economy is driven by consumer spending. But folks are starting to hesitate, with the tariffs and some other things. What do you tell the folks that feel it's uncertain right now? They don't want to invest in buying things or invest in certain investments.
Yeah. Well, what I would first say is I would draw a distinction between buying things and investing, right? There's this old adage that turns out all old adages, they have some wisdom in them, right? What's the difference between poor people and rich people, right? Poor people spend their money, right? Buying things, It's funny. I to go back to the old Army, the Army roots, right? In my days, SEALs went to jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure you spent some time at Benning.
I went to airborne school at some SEAls myself.
Oh, right, right. Yeah, you do the 250-foot jump towers, that stuff, the black hats. For people who don't know, airborne jump school is basically learning to fall out of an airplane.
Literally, the first week is ground week, where you learn how to fall.
Yeah, all you do is
together.
fall off a platform. Yeah,
yes.
Feet, knees, head. So, but I remember when I started Valor, which was originally called Guild, that the first thing I did was I mapped the distance from the front gate of Benning to the first used car lot where you could buy a used Mustang or a new Mustang or Camaro at a 21% APR kind of thing, and it was 0.3 miles. right? Yeah, sometimes I ask people to guess, but like you guys would know, instinctively, right? And right next to that, like used car lot was payday loan. Exactly.
Yep.
The VIL,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Every base has a VIL.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's this VIL outside, and there's this entire ecosystem designed to take service members' money. But there are not a lot of people out there now outside yourselves, right, who are really, really dedicated to this task of helping increase the wealth of the military community. And that's done through investing. So how does that come back to the tariffs? Look, the tariffs are extraordinarily complicated. We have a grand economic experiment in its infancy right now. And I think the second and third order effects are really, really difficult to know. But here's what I do know, is that the increased price of consumer goods disproportionately affects our servicemen and women. And the reason for that is multiple, right? But one of the primary reasons is that, our salaries are set by the U.S. Congress, right? So if the price of consumer goods goes up for socioeconomic peers of our veterans, say an auto worker in Detroit, right? The UAW can renegotiate those contracts, maybe not in real time, but sort of dependent on current economic conditions. And like, Pat, you tell me, you would know better than me, like, what does it take to get a service member's pay raise through Congress?
Oh yeah, listen, once a year, NDAA, right? The
Right.
National Defense Authorization Act.
Right. So it just doesn't have like the nimbleness, and service members, they are stuck. We can think of sometimes tariffs or at least increased consumer prices as a regressive tax, right? We don't make that much money in the military. And so when the consumer goods goes up, it doesn't hurt JP, right? But it does hurt like an E3, making an E3 salary. And an E3's family members, more importantly.
Yeah, we're living through some times right now that it's really hard, again, to go back to the original trust issue, to like decipher from the headline versus the thing that we should move on versus the thing that we shouldn't move on. So I do want to ask you a little bit about your perspective on this. You've lived around the world. If you follow your Instagram, you're all over the place. You've been all over the place. And we created like a global...
Put a little NSFW on that. 'Cause if you follow my Instagram, you see that I loathe shirts. Like, I would only dress up for you guys,
So like, we're kind of shifting from the way that we did it post-World War II into trying to be a more domestic-oriented economy. And I'm just really interested in your opinion about how that you think that's going to shape how people should invest over the next period of time, and what you're seeing as it relates to that kind of movement.
Yeah. Here's what I'll say, right? And this is not financial advice, it's philosophy, right? I remain unconvinced, although there are much bigger 10,000-pound brains than me, that we can revert to a manufacturing-based economy. I just don't know if that is the future of the modern American economy. Like, you look at the average wage of an hourly American worker, $35 an hour, right? You look at the average wage of a manufacturing worker in Mexico, $3.84. With the lifestyle expectation of the American worker, we're never going to be able to compete on a labor basis. And maybe we shouldn't, right? Maybe there are efficiencies and economies of scale that can be done with some exporting. Smarter people than me, like I said, will balance those ratios appropriately. But I think in the number one principle that I urge all of our veterans and active duty military, law enforcement, first responders, is I think that this diversification portfolio in times of uncertainty is the fundamental principle that you have to follow. We wouldn't go to war with one bullet in our magazine, right? With one bullet in our M4, right? And you certainly shouldn't go to economic war with anything other than a fully diversified portfolio. When we originally built the Siebert Valor platform, we gave little badges. Some people, like in Silicon Valley, would call it gamification.
Of course.
Yeah. Right. But we called it badges, and the badges looked suspiciously like the National Defense Ribbon or maybe a Meritorious Service Medal.
Good
right?
job for saving.
Yeah. And so, like, when you made your first investment, we gave you, what's the Participation Medal of the Military, the National Defense Ribbon, right?
Yeah.
And that's, what we call a nudge in economics for good behavior. The second nudge, though, is that when you had more than 10 stocks in your portfolio, you got a second ribbon on your profile on the platform, right? And so and to me, that underscores how important this principle of diversification is. It's even more important during these economic times. And I'll give you like a crazy example, which I don't know if I'm supposed to say this or not. Let's just say like I had lunch with like the head of a large state pension fund. All right. And, these are, you're talking like hundreds of billions of dollars in assets. And this guy had just the portfolio had grown so much over the last 2 years because of the growth of the market, especially like with the Mag 7 and all of the tech-centric stuff. It had grown so much that he had to rebalance this portfolio to follow this principle of diversity. And he had just bought $600 million worth of music rights. Now, the reason he had bought, right. So the reason he had bought music rights is because they're sort of essentially an annuity. They just keep paying out year over year on like a certain predictable rhythm. But here you have like a state pension manager of a massive $1 billion fund looking for alternative asset classes. And the reason he did that is because he knew that the public equities market was overweighted, and he was looking for like all kinds of alternative asset classes. And I think at a very micro scale, that can apply to the retail investor, the individual investor. And it's an extreme example of how important, especially now in this era of volatility, this principle of diversification is.
I think it's also important as you think about your personal asset allocation, right? Just like, never mind more portfolio, but like, do I have some money in real estate? Do I have some money in index funds? Do I have some money in individual stocks? Like, you've got to be smart about the way you're diversifying across all asset bases as you're moving forward.
Yeah, and we always push like our fundamental principles are things like your network is your net worth. Things like leverage GI Bill, leverage the VA home loan, and be smart about it. Make sure you're reading, and because God gave us all 2 ears but only one mouth for a reason. So all right, we're gonna go to rapid fire right now.
Yeah. So we end every segment with a warrior Q&A. And my very first question is my favorite, which is, what's some money advice that you know now that you wish you knew when you were younger?
Oh, pure and simple, like invest your money. Right?
Compound
Don't
interest.
gunsling.
Eighth wonder of the world.
Hey,
right?
Thank you, Mr. Buffett. I was hoping he would make an appearance on this podcast, and here he is, eighth wonder of the world. Yeah, invest early, invest often.
What's the biggest financial mistake people make on their way to success?
I think it's this spending versus investing. Yes, you got to save before you invest, right? But like all this stuff, like, you and I were talking fancy watches earlier, like all that frivolous stuff can come later, and you can buy more of it if you follow the compound interest law.
Absolutely. And then what has been the most unexpected part of your journey?
I guess entering a domain that I never thought I would be in. My life has been a series of haphazard events. First, I was in the military, then I was in the media, and now I'm in money. And I always thought finance was boring, right? And it's not. Like, shit is exciting, and I love it. And how awesome is it? Like, now 3 of us veterans can reconnect on a new mission. It's cool.
Thanks, brother. So that's going to wrap up our show. So listen, subscribe, and review Warrior Money on your Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast, or find us, frankly, at Yahoo Finance. I'm Patrick Murphy.
And I'm Dan Kunze. We'll see you again next week.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.